It's early winter, the year 1274, and somewhere along the northern coast of Kyushu, a young warrior named Takazaki Suenaga is checking the fittings on his horse in the grey hour before dawn, unaware that this is the morning everything he understands about the world is about to be tested. Come with me tonight to that coastline, to a shore that had never once in all its long history seen an invasion fleet arrive from across the sea. Settle in, let your shoulders drop. This is a night to lie back, close your eyes, and let the past carry you somewhere far from here. On the beaches near Hakata Bay, several hundred Japanese warriors are about to face an armada, unlike anything Japan has ever prepared for. Somewhere over the horizon, hidden by mist and distance, 900 ships are closing in, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers drawn from 3 conquered peoples under the banner of the most powerful empire the world has ever known. The men on the beach do not yet know the size of what is coming. They only know that scouts have reported ships, many ships, and that by nightfall everything about how war is fought in Japan may be about to change forever. Takazaki Suenaga is not a famous man, not yet, and history would likely have forgotten him entirely if not for what happens to him over the following days, and for the fact that he later pays out of his own dwindling resources to have the whole story painted onto a long silk scroll, so that no one could ever say it did not happen the way he remembered it. On this particular morning he is a minor retainer from Higo province, a samurai of modest land and modest means, the kind of man history rarely bothers to name. He has spent his life training in the way his father trained him, and his father before that in a system of combat built on individual skill, on horseback archery, on the announcement of one's name and lineage before riding forward to meet a worthy opponent in single combat. It is a code that has served Japanese warriors for centuries, refined through generations of civil conflict fought against other Japanese warriors who shared the same rules, the same expectations, the same sense of honor in the moment before the blade or the arrow finds its mark. Suenaga has no way of knowing, as he adjusts his armor in the cold morning air, that the men arriving on those ships have never heard of these customs, and would not observe them even if they had. He's about to ride into a kind of warfare that Japan has never encountered, against an enemy who fights not as individuals seeking glory, but as a single coordinated machine moving in formation, loosing volleys of arrows in unison, wielding a weapon that Japan has never seen before, a small clay ball packed with gunpowder that explodes with a noise and a light that will terrify men and horses alike before the two sides have even closed the distance between them. What actually happened on that beach and on the beaches that would follow 7 years later, when the Mongols returned in far greater numbers, is a story that Japan would tell itself for centuries in ways that grew larger and stranger with each retelling, until the true events became almost impossible to separate from the myth that grew up around them. There is a wind in this story, a wind so violent and so precisely timed that generations of Japanese would come to believe the gods themselves had reached down to save their homeland, a name that would echo forward through history and resurface centuries later, attached to pilots flying their final missions in an entirely different war. But before the wind, there is the fighting itself, ferocious and confused, and utterly unlike anything the samurai class had trained for. And there is a question that historians still turn over today, one worth sitting with as this story unfolds: how much of Japan's survival was really the storm, and how much was the desperate, stubborn resistance of men like Suenaga, holding a beach they had never expected to have to defend. Before we go further into that morning at Hakata Bay, if this is the kind of history you've been looking for, something slower and deeper than most channels offer, I would be glad if you took a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who might be looking for exactly this. And I would love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what drew you to this particular story. I read every one, even the ones that come in at 3 in the morning, Now get comfortable, pull the blanket up, and let us go back to that shore. To understand why Suenaga is standing on that beach at all, why a relatively small island nation is facing down the military machine of an empire that already controls more territory than any power before it, we have to step back a considerable distance past this single cold morning into the decades before it, when a boy born on the Mongolian steppe was still watching his grandfather build an empire that would eventually stretch from the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Europe. That boy grows into a man history remembers as Kublai Khan, and by the time he turns his attention toward the islands of Japan, he has already done something no ruler in Chinese history had managed before him. He has conquered enough of China to found his own dynasty to sit upon a throne that blends Mongol authority with Chinese imperial tradition, and to look eastward across a narrow stretch of water toward a country that has, for reasons its own rulers barely understand, never once bothered to send tribute, never once acknowledged his authority, never once responded to his letters in the way every other power on his borders eventually had. Scholars still debate exactly what drove Kublai Khan to commit so many resources, so many ships, so many soldiers to a campaign against an island nation of comparatively little strategic value. Whether it was genuine ambition, wounded pride, or some combination, the surviving record does not fully explain. What is certain is that the silence coming from Japan, the refusal to bend, becomes something Kublai Khan cannot simply let stand. And so letter by letter, envoy by envoy, a slow and largely one-sided negotiation begins, one that Japan's warrior government sitting in its capital at Kamakura has almost no framework for understanding, because nothing in their own history has prepared them for a demand quite like this one, arriving from a power quite this large. That morning on the beach near Hakata Bay does not begin with the ships. It begins years earlier in a series of decisions made by men who had never met each other, on opposite sides of a sea, neither fully understood, each one certain of his own strength, and largely blind to the others. It begins with an empire built on speed and coordination facing a warrior culture built on individual honor and centuries of internal war. Two entirely different ways of understanding what it means to fight, about to collide on a stretch of sand that had until that winter known nothing but the ordinary rhythm of fishing boats and tide pools and the slow turning of Japanese seasons. What happens next reshapes not only that coastline, but the very foundations of the government that rules it in ways that will not become fully clear for another 50 years, but that is still ahead of us. For now, we stay with the empire building itself in the west, gathering its strength, deciding that the silence from Japan has gone on long enough. The empire that Kublai Khan inherits, or more precisely, the empire he spends decades fighting to secure for himself, did not begin with him at all. It began nearly 2 generations earlier, on a stretch of grassland far to the north, when a man born under the name Temujin united a scattering of rival clans that had spent centuries raiding and warring against one another, and turned them into the single most effective military force the world had yet produced. History remembers him as Genghis Khan, and by the time of his death his descendants control a territory so vast that no single mind then or now can easily hold its full shape in view. It stretches from the Sea of Japan in the east to the edges of Poland and Hungary in the west, a swath of land larger than any empire, before it larger in fact than any empire, that would come after it for centuries. Kublai Khan is Genghis Khan's grandson, and he does not simply inherit this world. He spends the better part of his life fighting his own brothers for the right to rule even a portion of it. And by the time he finally secures the throne, the empire his grandfather built has already begun splitting into smaller, more manageable pieces, each ruled by a different branch of the family, each drifting slowly toward its own identity and its own ambitions. What Kublai Khan chooses to build with his share of that inheritance is something genuinely new, something none of his Mongol ancestors had attempted in quite the same way. Rather than simply raiding and withdrawing the traditional pattern of steppe warfare for generations, he sets out to conquer the whole of China and rule it not as an occupying army but as a legitimate emperor adopting the trappings of Chinese imperial governance, even while remaining in every meaningful sense an outsider to the culture he now governs. He founds a dynasty and gives it a name, the Yuan, and he moves his capital to a city that will one day be called Beijing, and slowly, methodically, he grinds down the last resistance of the Song dynasty that had ruled southern China for centuries before him. This process takes years longer than most people realize, and it is still unfinished, still an open wound at the exact moment his attention turns eastward toward the sea, toward a country that, from where Kublai Khan sits, appears to be little more than a stubborn afterthought on the edge of his growing world. Here is a detail that surprises most people when they first hear it. That's something that rarely makes it into the shorter, more dramatic tellings of this story. Kublai Khan does not begin with ships and soldiers. He begins with letters, and he sends quite a lot of them patiently over the course of nearly a decade, each one carried not by his own hand but by way of the Korean kingdom of Goryeo, a smaller power that has already been forced into submission, and now finds itself the reluctant middleman in a negotiation it never asked to be part of. The tone of these letters is not at first the language of an ultimatum. It reads, at least on its surface, as an invitation framed in the diplomatic customs of the era, addressed to the ruler of Japan as though between equals, proposing what Kublai Khan calls friendly relations, and asking almost gently by the standards of the time that Japan send envoys and open some form of exchange between the two courts. It is only in the closing lines of these letters, tucked beneath the polite language, that the actual message becomes clearer warning, wrapped in courtesy, suggesting that no ruler wishes to resort to arms, but that arms remain, of course, an option should friendship be refused. The problem, and it is a problem that will echo forward through the entire conflict to come, is that the government receiving these letters in Japan has almost no experience reading this kind of language, and even less interest in responding to it the way Kublai Khan expects. Japan in this period is not governed in any real sense by its emperor who sits in Kyoto as a figure of ceremonial and religious importance, but wields little actual political power. Real authority rests with the shogunate, a military government based far to the east in the town of Kamakura, run by a warrior clan called the Hojo, who hold power not as emperors or kings, but as regents acting in the name of a shogun, who is himself often a child or a figurehead controlled by the Hojo family behind him. It is an unusual layered structure of authority, one that Kublai Khan's court likely does not fully understand when it sends its letters, expecting a response from a single sovereign ruler the way such letters would be answered almost anywhere else in the known world. What actually happens is that the letters arrive in Kyoto, are read by an imperial court that has no power to act on them, are forwarded to Kamakura where the real decision-makers are, and then one after another are simply set aside, not answered, not acknowledged, not even formally refused, just left unanswered year after year, envoy after envoy, until the silence itself becomes an answer that Kublai Khan cannot continue to ignore. Scholars still debate exactly why the Kamakura government chose silence rather than diplomacy, whether it stemmed from genuine confidence in Japan's natural sea defences, from internal disagreement within the shogunate about how seriously to take the threat, or from a simple and very human failure to grasp the scale of the power now asking and increasingly demanding their attention. What the surviving record does suggest is that the man who eventually takes charge of formulating Japan's response, a young regent named Hojo Tokimune, barely into his 20s when the pressure from the continent reaches its peak, appears to have understood the danger more clearly than many around him, and chooses deliberately and with full awareness of the risk to refuse Kublai Khan outright, rather than bow to a power that has already conquered most of the known world around it. It is worth sitting with that decision for a moment, the sheer weight of it. A young man, barely more than a boy by modern standards, holding the fate of an entire nation in his hands, choosing defiance over submission against an empire that has by this point absorbed kingdoms far larger and far older than Japan. Whether this was courage, stubbornness, or simply a warrior culture's inability to imagine surrender as an honourable option, the historical evidence remains incomplete, and probably always will. What makes this refusal even more remarkable is something that rarely gets mentioned alongside it, a detail that adds a strange and human weight to everything that follows. Kublai Khan's fifth and final embassy, sent in the year 1279, does not simply go unanswered the way the earlier ones had. The envoys who arrive on this occasion are taken to the beach at Hakata, the very stretch of coastline where the fighting will later unfold, and they are executed there publicly, a decision that transforms what had been a slow-grinding diplomatic standoff into something that Kublai Khan can no longer treat as a matter of patience. In the customs of the era, the killing of an emissary is among the gravest insults one power can offer, another a violation that all but guarantees war rather than merely inviting it. It is difficult to know at this distance whether the Kamakura government fully understood what they were setting in motion when they made that choice, or whether it was in its own way a message meant to be unmistakable in its finality, a way of ensuring there would be no more letters to leave unanswered, no more envoys to politely ignore. By the time word of the executed envoys reaches Kublai Khan's court, the invasion that follows is no longer simply a matter of subduing a stubborn neighbour. It has become, for an emperor who has spent his entire life conquering everything, he turns his attention toward a matter that touches something closer to his own legitimacy, his own sense of what an empire of his size is owed by the smaller powers along its edges. And so the machinery of an empire that had already conquered more territory than any before, it begins to turn towards the sea, towards shipyards along the coast of conquered China and vassal Korea, toward the gathering of soldiers drawn from peoples who had themselves been defeated only years earlier, and now find themselves conscripted into a fleet bound for a country most of them have never seen and know almost nothing about. Somewhere in Kamakura, a young regent who has just made the most consequential decision of his life is left to wonder in whatever quiet moments a man in his position is allowed exactly what kind of storm he's just called down upon his own shores, and exactly how a nation with no standing army in the modern sense, no navy built for open combat, and no experience whatsoever facing an enemy from beyond its own waters might possibly be expected to survive it. Long before Kublai Khan's letters ever reach Japanese shores, the warrior class waiting to receive them has already been shaped by nearly 200 years of a very particular kind of conflict, one fought almost entirely against itself. To understand the men who will eventually stand on the beaches of Kyushu facing an enemy from across the sea, it helps to first understand what kind of world produced them, because the samurai of 1274 are not soldiers in any sense a modern audience would immediately recognize. They are something closer to a landed warrior aristocracy, men bound to their lords not through wages or conscription, but through a personal, almost familial obligation, an exchange of loyalty for protection and land that the Japanese of this era call the bond between lord and vassal, and that the Kamakura government has spent generations refining into the very foundation of how the country is governed. This bond, this system of mutual obligation is worth pausing on because it explains a great deal about the decisions Japan's leadership will make in the years ahead. Decisions that seem strange or even self-destructive unless you understand the logic underneath them. A samurai in this period does not fight for an abstract idea of nation largely because no one in Japan yet thinks in those terms. He fights because his family's standing its land, its very survival across generations, depends on maintaining the favour of the lord above him and ultimately the shogunate itself. When a warrior distinguishes himself in battle, he expects reward typically in the form of land confiscated from a defeated enemy, land that can then be passed down to his children and used to secure the loyalty of his own retainers in turn. It is a closed system, elegant in its own way, built for a very specific kind of warfare, the kind Japan has known for centuries. Warfare fought against other Japanese clans over Japanese land, resolved through Japanese customs of victory and reward every participant on both sides understands without needing to be told. What almost no one in Kamakura fully grasps in the years leading up to the first Mongol ships appearing on the horizon is how completely this entire system depends on there being conquered territory to redistribute once the fighting ends. It is a quiet detail easy to overlook amid the drama of armour and swords and coastal defences, but it will matter enormously later in this story, more than almost anything else that happens on the battlefield itself. For now, though, in the years before the invasion, this system produces something else entirely, something worth sitting with for a moment. It produces men who are extraordinarily skilled, disciplined, from childhood in horseback archery, in swordsmanship, in a code of personal honour that prizes individual distinction above almost everything else. The ideal samurai encounter, as it has been practiced for generations by the time Suenaga and men like him come of age, begins with a warrior riding forward alone, announcing his name, his lineage, and sometimes even a brief account of his own past deeds, before engaging a worthy opponent who has done the same. It is a style of combat built around recognition, around being seen and remembered, because glory that no one witnesses is, in the logic of this warrior culture, barely glory at all. It's worth noting, and this is a detail that surprises many people encountering this history for the first time, that Japan in this period possesses no standing military in anything like the modern sense. There is no national army waiting in barracks, no unified command structure ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. What exists instead is a patchwork of regional loyalties, provincial warrior bands answerable to their own local lords, who are themselves answerable to the shogunate in Kamakura, a chain of obligation that has to be activated link by link whenever a genuine threat appears. When word finally reaches Kamakura that Kublai Khan's demands have hardened into something closer to an ultimatum, the response is not the swift, centralized mobilization a modern reader might expect. It is a slower, more deliberate process of calling upon regional lords across the western provinces, particularly those in Kyushu, the island closest to the Korean coast and therefore the most exposed to whatever comes across that water first. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how much genuine strategic planning went into Japan's early defensive preparations, and how much was simply the traditional machinery of feudal obligation grinding forward the way it always had applied to a threat nobody in Kamakura had ever faced before. What does survive in the historical record suggests a government caught in an unusual position, aware enough of the danger to issue defensive orders across multiple provinces, yet still operating within a framework built entirely for warfare against other Japanese warriors who shared the same customs, the same expectations about how a battle unfolds. There is a kind of dramatic irony sitting quietly underneath these years of preparation, one that becomes clearer only in hindsight. Japan's warrior class is by any reasonable measure extraordinarily accomplished at the kind of fighting it has spent centuries perfecting, and almost none of that accumulated skill translates cleanly to what is coming. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into shorter tellings of this story, and it says something quietly profound about how differently the two sides understand the coming conflict. While Kamakura mobilizes its warrior bands according to feudal custom gathering, men whose loyalty runs through personal bonds of land and family, The force assembling across the water under Kublai Khan's command is being built along an entirely different logic, one closer to what modern readers would recognize as a professional multi-ethnic military machine. The soldiers who will eventually cross to Japan are drawn not from a single unified people but from at least 3 distinct populations: ethnic Mongols serving as officers and cavalry specialists, Han Chinese soldiers and engineers absorbed into Yuan service following the ongoing conquest of the Song dynasty, and Korean troops and sailors supplied by the Kingdom of Goryeo, which has itself only recently been forced into submission and now finds itself compelled to build the very ships and supply the very soldiers that will carry this invasion forward, a bitter irony that Goryeo's own chroniclers do not fail to note in their surviving records. Scholars still debate how much genuine loyalty existed among these conscripted forces, particularly the Korean sailors and soldiers who had little personal stake in Kublai Khan's ambitions and every reason to resent the enormous burden the shipbuilding effort placed on their own devastated kingdom still recovering from decades of Mongol conquest. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because it means the fleet gathering to cross the strait toward Japan is not in any simple sense a Mongol invasion at all, despite how the story is so often remembered and simplified in the retelling. It is closer to an imperial coalition assembled under duress in many cases, moving according to a unified command structure and coordinated battlefield tactics that stand in stark contrast to the individual, honor-bound style of combat the samurai have spent their entire lives mastering. Where a samurai has been trained since childhood to seek out a worthy opponent and engage him directly, the soldiers crossing the water have been trained to advance in disciplined formation, to loose coordinated volleys of arrows on command, to fight as a single organism rather than as a collection of individual warriors each pursuing personal distinction. Neither side is wrong exactly in the context of the wars each has previously fought, but only one of these two approaches to warfare has ever been tested against the other, and that test has not yet come. What makes this coming collision genuinely tragic rather than simply a matter of one army being technically superior to another is how little either side actually understands about what the other believes it is doing. To the soldiers gathering under Kublai Khan's banner, this is simply another campaign in a long series of campaigns, one more territory to be brought under the Emperor's authority through the tactics that have already conquered half the known world. To the samurai gathering along the Kyushu coastline, mobilized under the old feudal obligations that have governed Japanese warfare for generations, this is something closer to an existential violation. An enemy without honor, without recognizable customs arriving from beyond the edge of the known world to threaten a homeland that has never, in all its remembered history, faced a foreign army on its own soil. It is this gap, this fundamental mismatch in understanding more than any difference in numbers or technology, that will shape the confused, brutal fighting that follows on the beaches near Hakata Bay. And somewhere in that gap sits a smaller, quieter human story, easy to lose amid the scale of empires and fleets and feudal obligations, the story of individual men like Takazaki Suenaga, riding out from their provinces toward a coastline they have been told to defend, carrying with them a warrior code that has served their families for generations, with no way of knowing that the very rules they have trained their entire lives to follow are about to meet an enemy who has never heard of them and would not follow them even if he had. By the 18th day of the 10th month in the year 1274, the waiting that has stretched across nearly a decade of unanswered letters finally comes to an end, though not in the way anyone in Kamakura had quite pictured it. The fleet does not appear first at Hakata Bay, the wide defensible harbour that Japan's leaders have spent years watching with the most concern. It appears first at a small wind-scoured island, sitting alone in the strait between Korea and Japan, a place called Tsushima, whose entire military garrison numbers perhaps a few dozen men under a local deputy named Sosuke Kuni. There is something almost unbearably quiet about this detail once you sit with it. An empire that has spent decades conquering kingdoms and dynasties makes its first landfall in Japan, not against a great fortress or a mustered army, but against a handful of coastal defenders on an island most people in Kamakura could not have pointed to on a map. What happens at Tsushima over the following days is recorded in the surviving Japanese and Korean sources in language that is sparse and unadorned, which somehow makes it heavier rather than lighter. So Sukakuni rides out to meet the landing force with the small number of horsemen available to him, following the only kind of warfare he has ever known, and is overwhelmed within hours by an enemy fighting in a formation and rhythm his training had never prepared him to counter. The island's defenders are killed nearly to the last man. What follows the battle itself is harder to sit with, and the Master Guide's own commitment to unflinching honesty asks that it not be softened here. Korean and Japanese chronicles describe the invading force moving through Tsushima's villages afterward, and the accounts that survive speak of civilian casualties and captives taken in numbers that still unsettle historians reading them today. It is worth pausing on this, not to linger in it, but simply to hold the truth of it for a moment before moving forward, because the war that follows is remembered centuries later mostly for its battles and its famous storm, and the smaller, quieter tragedy of Tsushima is one that popular memory has largely let slip beneath the surface. The fleet does not linger on Tsushima. It moves on a matter of days later to a second island lying between Tsushima and the Japanese mainland, a place called Iki. And there a strikingly similar pattern repeats itself, a small local garrison, riding out under a deputy named Taira. No Kagetaka met and overwhelmed by a coordinated force it has no framework for resisting. Here too, the surviving record speaks of villages taken and civilians swept into the same fate that had already befallen Tsushima. There is a detail from Iki that surfaces in later Japanese accounts difficult to verify with full certainty, but persistent enough across multiple sources that most historians treat it as at least broadly reflective of what happened, describing captives being restrained in a manner meant specifically to prevent them from fighting back or fleeing during the fleet's onward journey. The evidence for the precise details remains incomplete, filtered as it is through accounts written after the fact and coloured by the fear and outrage of a nation processing its first experience of foreign invasion. But the broad shape of what happened on these two islands is not seriously disputed by historians as working from the Japanese, Korean, and Chinese sources that all converge on roughly the same picture. Word of what has happened on Tsushima and Iki reaches the mainland faster than the fleet itself does, carried by fishermen and survivors fleeing westward, and it arrives in Kyushu not as rumour, but as confirmed specific horror, which changes something important about how the defenders of Hakata Bay will meet the fleet when it finally appears off their own coastline in early winter. This is worth noting because it complicates any simple story of Japanese unpreparedness. The men gathering at Hakata Bay by the time the invasion fleet arrives, they are not walking into this fight blind the way So Sukakuni and Taira no Kagetaka had been. They already know with a clarity that must have been almost unbearable exactly what awaits them and their families should the beach fall the way the islands had. And here is where a detail surfaces that rarely gets the attention it deserves in the way this story is usually told, a detail that reframes the entire coming battle in a quieter, more human light. Historians studying the demographics of the defending force at Hakata Bay have noted something striking about who actually rides out to meet the invasion when it arrives. This is not primarily the flower of Kamakura's most celebrated warrior families, the great-named lords whose exploits fill the grander chronicles of the era. It is overwhelmingly local men, provincial samurai of modest rank like Suenaga farmers turned warriors defending the very shoreline where their own families live, men with a far more immediate and personal stake in the outcome than any abstract sense of national duty could have provided. Scholars still debate how much this local, deeply rooted character of the Kyushu defense shaped the ferocity and persistence of the resistance that follows, where the men fighting to protect their own villages and their own families fought with a different kind of resolve than a professional army moving through unfamiliar territory might have. It is a question that cannot be answered with certainty from the surviving sources, but it is difficult not to wonder whether that difference mattered. Does an army conquering its way across half the known world expect this kind of resistance from an island it has already dismissed in its own official correspondence as a stubborn afterthought unworthy of true diplomacy? Everything in the UN court's prior planning suggests the answer is no, that Kublai Khan's commanders anticipated something closer to what they had found on Tsushima and Iki, a quick, overwhelming victory against scattered, outmatched defenders. What actually awaits them at Hakata Bay when the fleet finally turns toward the mainland in the closing days of autumn is something considerably more complicated. A coastline defended not by a handful of isolated deputies but by thousands of warriors who have had weeks of warning, who have watched the smoke of what happened on the islands behind them and who ride out onto that beach carrying not only their training but something else. Something harder to put a name to, a raw and personal understanding of exactly what defeat here would mean for everyone and everything they love. The ships are already visible from the shore by the time the last of the defenders finish gathering. Along the curve of Hakata Bay, dark shapes multiplying across the grey water, in numbers that no one standing on that beach has ever seen assembled in one place before. Somewhere among the mounted men waiting there adjusting the fittings of his armour. One final time Takazaki Suenaga watches the fleet draw closer, carrying with him everything his family's warrior tradition has taught him about how a battle is supposed to unfold, and no way yet of knowing just how little of that training is about to survive first contact with the enemy now approaching his shore. The fighting at Hakata Bay begins as so many turning points in history do, with a sound rather than a sight. Suenaga and the men mounted beside him have spent their entire lives training for combat that opens with a voice, a warrior riding forward to announce his name and his lineage before the first arrow is loosed, a formal beginning that gives every encounter a shape both sides understand. What greets them instead as the UN ships close the final stretch of water, and their soldiers begin pouring onto the beach is a wall of drums and horns and shouted commands in languages the defenders cannot follow, a wave of coordinated noise meant not to invite a worthy opponent forward but to overwhelm the senses of everyone standing in its path. Several of the surviving Japanese accounts describe horses bolting in terror before a single blade is drawn, spooked by sounds and formations they have never encountered on any Japanese battlefield, and it is worth pausing on how much this alone must have cost the defenders in those opening minutes. An entire cavalry tradition built on discipline and control suddenly fighting against its own animals as much as against the enemy advancing toward them. What follows over the coming hours is not by most historical reconstructions a single decisive battle, so much as a long, grinding, exhausting series of clashes stretched along the curve of the bay, samurai riding forward individually or in small family bands, meeting a Yuan infantry that has been trained from the beginning to fight as a unified body rather than as a collection of individual combatants. This is the moment the mismatch described earlier in this story stops being an abstract observation about two different military cultures and becomes something lived in real time by real men. A samurai riding forward alone, following every instinct his training has given him, finds himself met not by a single opposing rider willing to engage him in kind, but by a formation of soldiers loosing coordinated volleys of arrows and closing ranks in a manner built specifically to answer exactly this kind of individual charge. Suenaga's own account, preserved on the scroll he later commissions, describes riding directly into this kind of formation, an act that reads from a modern vantage point as almost unbearably brave and almost unbearably naive, in equal measure a man doing precisely what his entire life had trained him to do, against an enemy who had never agreed to fight by those same rules. There is a detail from this fighting that surprises most people encountering the story for the first time, a small technological difference that carried an outsized psychological weight on that beach. The Yuan forces bring with them a weapon Japan has never seen or heard before, a hollow ceramic or iron shell packed with gunpowder thrown or launched toward the defenders and exploding with a burst of noise, smoke, and shrapnel entirely unlike anything in the Japanese military experience of the era. Chinese and Japanese sources refer to these devices by a name that translates roughly to iron cannon or thunder crash bomb, and their actual battlefield effectiveness as weapons of injury appears based on the archaeological evidence recovered centuries later to have been considerably more modest than their effectiveness as instruments of pure terror. It is worth sitting with that distinction for a moment, because it says something quietly important about what actually wins and loses battles. A weapon does not need to kill a great many men to change the course of a fight if it can make horses rear and riders hesitate at exactly the wrong instant. And several accounts from this engagement suggest that is closer to what these early bombs accomplished, less a weapon of destruction than a weapon of disruption, arriving at a moment when disruption alone was enough to tip individual encounters one way or another along that long stretch of beach. Suenaga himself does not escape this day unmarked. His own account, remarkable for its honesty in an era when many warriors' chronicles lean towards self-glorification, describes being wounded during the fighting and having his horse struck beneath him, forced back from the front of the engagement in a manner that in the old warrior code he had grown up within might have carried some shame had the entire nature of this battle not already made a mockery of every rule that code depended on. He survives the day, which is more than can be said for a great many of the men fighting alongside him, and by evening, the Japanese forces along Hakata Bay have been pushed back from the immediate shore, falling behind an older defensive earthwork called the Mizuki. A long raised barrier originally built centuries earlier for an entirely different threat, repurposed now as a line. The exhausted defenders can regroup behind as darkness settles over the bay. What happens next is one of the genuine puzzles at the center of this entire conflict, a question historians have turned over for generations without ever reaching full agreement, and it deserves to be treated honestly as the uncertainty that it is, rather than smoothed over into false confidence. By the following morning, the Yuan fleet that had spent the previous day pressing so hard against the Japanese line gone from the bay, entirely withdrawn back out to open water, and within days, sailing away from Japan's coast altogether, ending the first invasion almost as abruptly as it had begun. The traditional explanation repeated for centuries in Japanese memory holds that a violent storm struck the anchored fleet that night, scattering and damaging ships badly enough to force a full retreat, an early instance of what would later be remembered as a divine wind protecting the homeland. Scholars still debate how much of this account reflects what genuinely happened on the water that night, and how much reflects a story that grew larger and more providential with each retelling in the decades that followed, particularly once a second, far more famous storm several years later gave the whole narrative a satisfying symmetry that later chroniclers may have been easier to project backward onto this first campaign as well. There is another explanation that a number of historians find at least equally plausible, one that has nothing to do with weather at all, and it is worth holding both possibilities in mind rather than settling too quickly on the more dramatic version. Some surviving Yuan and Korean sources suggest that the invasion's commanders, having taken heavier resistance and heavier losses at Hakata Bay than they had anticipated, and facing a shrinking supply of arrows and a fleet that had already accomplished a demonstration of force against Japan's outer islands, may have made a calculated decision to withdraw and regroup, rather than press forward into a prolonged campaign against a defense that had proven far more determined than the fighting on Tsushima and Iki had led them to expect. Perhaps it was the storm. Perhaps it was exhausted supply lines and a commander's sober judgment about diminishing returns. Perhaps, as is so often true in history, it was both forces acting together, a damaged fleet and a bruised confidence arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. The evidence remains incomplete enough that no historian today can say with total certainty which explanation carries more weight, and there is something almost fitting in that uncertainty, a reminder that even the events we think we know best still hold room for honest not knowing. What is not in question? Whatever combination of storm and strategy sent that First Fleet home is what the withdrawal means for the men left standing on the beach at Hakata Bay in its aftermath. Suenaga and the defenders who survived that day wake to find the horizon empty of ships, the invasion that had seemed only hours earlier to threaten the complete unravelling of everything their warrior tradition had ever prepared them for simply gone, leaving behind a bay strewn with wreckage and a coastline forced to reckon in the quiet that follows with exactly how close it had come to a very different outcome. Does a nation that has just survived an invasion of this scale allow itself to believe the danger has passed for good, or does something in the manner of that ship's departure, so sudden, so unexplained, leave behind a deeper unease than victory alone can settle? For the men of Kamakura watching reports arrive from the west, the fleet's disappearance brings relief, but it does not bring rest. Somewhere beyond the horizon, an emperor who has never in his life accepted a single defeat without eventually returning to correct it is only beginning to decide what comes next. The years that follow the fleet's disappearance from Hakata Bay are not, as it turns out, years of rest for anyone in Kamakura, however much relief the empty horizon might have brought in that first quiet morning. Word of the invasion and of how narrowly the coastline of Kyushu had held against it travels back to the shogunate's seat with a weight that settles into the policy almost immediately, because whatever the true cause of the fleet's withdrawal, storm or strategy or some combination, the record will never fully resolve. No one among Japan's leadership is willing to gamble the nation's survival on that same uncertainty happening a second time. What Hojo Tokumun orders in the aftermath is, by the standards of 13th century Japan, an undertaking of almost startling scale. And it is worth spending a little time here because this is one of the parts of the story that popular memory tends to skip past on its way toward the more dramatic second invasion, even though what happens in these quiet years between the two campaigns says as much about Japan's survival as anything that happens on the beach itself. Along the curve of Hakata Bay, precisely where the fighting had been fiercest, the shogunate orders the construction of a defensive wall. A long barrier of packed earth, faced with stone and the surviving fragments of it still visible today, along stretches of the modern Fukuoka coastline, suggest a structure that eventually stretches for something close to 20 kilometers, standing roughly 2 meters high in most sections, deliberately positioned along the beach itself, so that any future landing force would have to fight its way up and over a fortified line before ever reaching open ground. The labour required to build something of this scale falls not on samurai alone, and this is a detail that rarely gets the attention it deserves in the way this story is usually told. The wall is constructed through a system of obligatory labour, drawn from the provinces of Kyushu land-owning, families of every rank, assigned specific sections of the coastline to fortify, according to the size and wealth of their holdings, which means the men and women who actually move the stone and pack the earth of this wall are for the most part ordinary provincial farmers and labourers, rather than the mounted warriors whose names fill the more celebrated accounts of the fighting itself. There is something quietly moving in this. If you sit with it for a moment, the image of a coastline entire communities help build with their own hands, section by section, family by family, not because any of them expect glory or reward for the labour, but because the alternative, should the wall not be finished in time, is a repeat of what had already happened on Tsushima and Iki. The evidence remaining from this period does not allow historians to say with certainty exactly how long the full wall took to complete, whether it was finished in a single sustained push or built up gradually across several years of intermittent labour. But what does survive suggests a project treated with genuine urgency, one that continues even as the shogunate simultaneously strengthens its coastal watch, arranges for regular patrols along the shoreline, and begins requiring the great temples and shrines of the nation to offer continuous prayers for the protection of Japan against the return everyone now assumes is coming. This last detail deserves a moment of its own because it says something about how thoroughly this threat reshapes Japanese religious life alongside its military preparations. Shrines and temples across the country, including some of the most sacred sites in the nation, such as the Grand Shrine at Ise, are formally called upon by the court to conduct sustained rituals, asking for divine protection against the invaders, a mobilization of spiritual energy running in parallel with the physical labor along the coastline. Two different kinds of defense being built at the same time by a nation that has no way of knowing which one, if either, will actually matter when the ships return. Scholars still debate how much genuine strategic confidence lay behind this religious mobilization, and how much reflected a simple, very human need to do something, anything, in the face of a threat too large for any single defensive measure to fully answer on its own. There is a lesser-known piece of this story worth including here, one that complicates the usual picture of a Japan standing purely on the defensive throughout these years. In the period following the first invasion, Kamakura seriously considers, and according to some surviving records, begins actively planning an offensive expedition of its own, a strike across the strait against the Korean kingdom of Goryeo, the very kingdom whose shipyards and conscripted sailors had supplied so much of the invading fleet. Whether this plan ever advances beyond preparation, whether ships are actually gathered or the troops formally assigned, remains genuinely uncertain in the surviving documentation, and most historians treat it today as a plan that was seriously discussed and perhaps partially prepared for, rather than one that ever came close to launching. But its mere existence in the record says something worth pausing on. Does a nation planning to strike outward at its enemy's own coastline still think of itself purely as a victim waiting to be saved by weather and prayer? Or does it think of itself as something more active, more willing to meet the coming danger on its own terms rather than simply enduring it? Whatever the full truth behind this abandoned counter-invasion, it suggests a Kamakura leadership under Tokumun that is thinking about this conflict in far more expansive terms than the popular story of a passive island saved purely by chance would suggest. None of this frantic preparation happens in a vacuum, and it is worth remembering as the wall along Hakata Bay slowly rises stone by stone exactly what is happening on the other side of the water during these same years. Kublai Khan does not treat the failure of his first invasion as a final verdict. Far from it. The surviving Yuan court records from this period describe an emperor who regards the setback at Hakata Bay as an unfinished matter rather than a closed one, and who spends the years following the withdrawal not reconsidering his ambitions toward Japan, but expanding them even as his attention and his resources remain divided by the ongoing still unfinished conquest of southern China's last Song dynasty holdouts. New envoys are eventually dispatched once again, carrying demands that read this time with even less patience than the earlier letters had shown. And Kamakura's response to these new demands will prove in its own way every bit as consequential as the silence and defiance that had brought the First Fleet to Japan's shores in the first place. Behind Hakata Bay, the wall continues to rise through the passing seasons, stone laid upon stone by hands that will mostly go unnamed in the histories written about this era. A quiet, unglamorous labour standing, in contrast to the mounted heroics remembered from the beach itself, and yet perhaps mattering just as much to whatever comes next. Somewhere across the water, an empire that has never once accepted defeat as final is already beginning to imagine a second attempt, one built on a scale that will make the first invasion look by comparison almost like a rehearsal. So the final embassy Kublai Khan sends toward Japan, dispatched in the year of 1279, carries with it an atmosphere entirely different from the earlier missions that had drifted quietly into Kamakura's silence for the better part of a decade. By this point, the Emperor's patience has visibly thinned, worn down by years of unanswered letters, and by the sting of a failed invasion he has never fully accepted as a closed matter. The 5 men chosen for this mission are not minor officials sent to test the waters once again. They arrive with a directness that suggests Kublai Khan already suspects, perhaps already knows, that this embassy will not be received any more warmly than the ones before it, and what happens to them on the beach at Hakata becomes in its own quiet way one of the more haunting details buried inside this entire war. It is worth returning to that execution now with a little more room to sit with it than earlier moments in this story allowed, because there is a human dimension to it that rarely survives the shorter, more condensed tellings of this history. The decision to kill the envoys is not made lightly or impulsively by the Kamakura government, and the surviving record suggests it emerges from a deliberate calculation on the part of Hojo Tokimuno, the same young regent who had refused Kublai Khan's very first demands years earlier, and who, now older and considerably more hardened by what Japan has already survived, appears to conclude that any further diplomacy would only be read across the water as weakness rather than restraint. There is something genuinely difficult to reconcile in this moment, and the Master Guide's own commitment to honesty asks that it not be smoothed over. Envoys, in the customs shared by nearly every civilization of this era, carried a kind of protection that transcended the conflicts between the powers. They represented a recognition that the person delivering an unwelcome message should not be made to suffer for the message itself. Tokimune's choice to set that convention aside is not remembered in Japanese sources as an act of cruelty, so much as an act of resolve, a line drawn so firmly that no ambiguity could remain about where Japan stood. Scholars still debate whether this was the wisest possible course, whether a different response might have altered what follows, or whether Kublai Khan's mind was already so fixed on a second invasion that nothing short of full submission would have changed his plans regardless. What is not in question is how Kublai Khan's court receives the news, where the years of prior silence had produced a slow, grinding, diplomatic frustration. The killing of an imperial embassy produces something with an entirely different texture, a wound to the emperor's authority that the vast machinery of the Yuan state now begins mobilizing to answer at a scale far beyond anything attempted in the first invasion. And this is where the story of the second campaign reveals something genuinely surprising to most people encountering it for the first time, a detail that separates this invasion from nearly every other military campaign of its era. Kublai Khan does not send one fleet toward Japan in 1281. He sends 2 launched from different ports built by different populations, intended to converge on the Japanese coastline and overwhelm it with a combined force that dwarfs anything the defenders at Hakata Bay had faced 7 years earlier. The first of these 2 fleets, known to history as the Eastern Route Army, sails from the Korean peninsula much as the earlier invasion had, carrying a combined force of Mongol, Chinese and Korean troops that most modern estimates place somewhere in the range of 40,000 soldiers, transported aboard roughly 900 vessels, numbers that already exceed the entire first invasion on their own. The second fleet, called the Southern Route Army, is something new entirely, and its origins say a great deal about how completely Kublai Khan's world had changed in the years since the first campaign. This force sails not from Korea, but from the southern coast of China, and it is built substantially from the resources of the Song dynasty, the very Chinese empire Kublai Khan had spent decades conquering and had only just fully absorbed in the years immediately before this invasion. The Southern Route Army carries, by most historical estimates, somewhere in the range of 100,000 soldiers, a staggering figure for any pre-modern military operation aboard a fleet that some accounts describe as numbering more than 3,000 ships, a fleet that had until quite recently belonged to an entirely different empire that Kublai Khan had only just finished dismantling. There is a detail here worth sitting with because it captures something quietly strange and worth remembering about how this second invasion comes together. A significant portion of the soldiers and sailors now bound for Japan under the Yuan banner had been only a handful of years earlier subjects of the Song dynasty fighting to preserve their own homeland against the very empire that now conscripts them into an invasion of someone else's. The evidence remains incomplete regarding how these newly absorbed Song forces regarded their role in this campaign, whether they served with genuine loyalty to their new Mongol rulers, or whether their participation reflected simple survival within a conquered population with little choice in the matter. But it is difficult not to wonder whether an army built so substantially from recently defeated soldiers carried into this invasion a different kind of resolve than the more seasoned Mongol and Chinese forces of the first campaign had. The scale of preparation required to assemble a force of this size leaves traces in the historical record that reach far beyond the battlefield itself, and one of the more striking lesser-known consequences of this build-up involves the landscape of southern China in these years. Contemporary Chinese sources describe extensive timber harvesting across the regions tasked with building the Southern Route Army's ship, forests stripped at a pace and scale unusual even for an empire accustomed to major construction projects, a reminder that an invasion fleet of several thousand vessels does not simply appear from nothing, but draws, instead on the labour, the resources, and in this case quite literally, the forests of an enormous and only recently subdued population. Somewhere in the accounts describing this shipbuilding effort, historians have also noted signs of haste that would later prove consequential. Vessels constructed quickly and under considerable pressure to meet Kublai Khan's timeline, built in some cases from rivercraft never intended for the open ocean crossing. They would eventually be asked to survive a detail that will matter a great deal once this fleet finally reaches Japanese waters. Back in Kamakura, word of this gathering storm reaches the shogunate through the same slow channels that had carried news of the first invasion. Merchant reports Korean intelligence passed along through what diplomatic contacts remained, and the accumulating silence from a Yuan court that had stopped sending envoys altogether now that its answer had already been given on the beach at Hakata. Does a government that has already survived one invasion and spent 7 years fortifying its coastline in anticipation of a second still feel the same fear it had felt the first time, or does years of preparation harden that fear into something closer to grim readiness? The wall along Hakata Bay stands finished now, or very nearly, so its stone facing weathered by 7 years of coastal wind and rain waiting for the test it had been built for. Hojo Tokimune, the same young regent who had once refused Kublai Khan's very first letter, and later ordered the execution of his final envoys, now oversees Japan considerably more prepared than the one that had faced the first invasion almost blind. Though no amount of preparation can fully answer the question of what happens when a combined force of nearly 140,000 soldiers carried across the water by more than 4,000 ships finally arrives off a coastline that has never in its history faced anything remotely close to this scale. Onward now to the 4th day of the 6th month in the year 1281, when the Eastern Route Army arrives first off the coast of Kyushu, several weeks ahead of the far larger Southern Route Army, still crossing from the recently conquered shores of southern China. What these soldiers find waiting for them at Hakata Bay is not the open, undefended beach their commanders remembered, or had been told to expect from the first invasion 7 years earlier. It is a stone wall weathered by 7 winters of coastal wind, running for a considerable stretch along the very shoreline, where the fighting had once been fiercest manned now by defenders who have spent those same 7 years training specifically for this return. The wall changes the shape of the year's battle in ways that become clear almost immediately, and it is worth pausing on exactly how, because the difference matters more than a simple structure of stone and packed earth might initially suggest. Where the first invasion had allowed the Yuan forces to land directly onto open beach and press inland with the full momentum of a coordinated advance, this second landing finds troops disembarking into a much narrower, much more exposed strip of shoreline, forced to fight their way up and over a fortified barrier before they can even begin to press the kind of advance that had worked so effectively 7 years earlier. Several Japanese accounts from this campaign describe fighting concentrated along the base of the wall itself. Samurai defending the barrier at close quarters, rather than meeting the invaders in the open cavalry engagements that had characterized so much of the earlier battle. A shift in the nature of combat that seems to have cost the Eastern Route Army dearly in the opening days of the campaign, unable to establish that the same kind of secure beachhead its commanders had planned around. What happens over the following weeks is where this second invasion reveals a texture almost entirely different from the first, and it introduces a dimension of this war that rarely receives the attention it deserves in the more condensed versions of this story. Unable to break through along the wall and unwilling to simply withdraw while awaiting the still absent southern fleet, the Eastern Route Army eventually falls back to occupy several nearby islands, including Shiga Island, connected to the mainland by a narrow sandbar, using them as a staging position while the wait for reinforcement drags on. And it is here during these weeks of stalemate that the Japanese defense stops being purely reactive and begins doing something the first invasion had never really allowed, for taking the fight to the anchored fleet itself under cover of darkness. This is a detail that surprises many people encountering this campaign for the first time, because it complicates the image so often repeated of samurai standing purely on the defensive behind their wall, waiting for either victory or a providential storm to decide the outcome. Japanese sources describe small fast boats launched at night from the mainland carrying samurai and their retainers directly alongside the massive anchored Yuan vessels close enough to board them. Set portions of them alight and cut down soldiers still disoriented from sleep before retreating back into the darkness the same way they had come. A samurai named Kono Mikiari is remembered in these accounts as having led one of the more daring of these raids, reportedly boarding an enemy vessel, capturing an officer, and returning to the mainland to report the feat directly, a kind of individual glory-seeking that the earlier battle at Hakata Bay had offered almost no room for, folded now into a new and considerably more improvised style of warfare that the years of preparation between the two invasions seem to have made possible. Scholars still debate how much these night raids actually accomplished in purely military terms, whether they meaningfully weakened the Eastern Route Army's fighting capacity or served a more psychological purpose, denying an already exhausted invading force the rest it needed, while it waited for reinforcements that showed no sign of arriving. There is another factor working against the Eastern Route Army during these same weeks, one that has nothing to do with samurai raids or stone walls at all, and it is a detail the more dramatic tellings of this story tend to leave out entirely, perhaps because it lacks the drama of combat, even though it may have mattered just as much to the eventual outcome. Tens of thousands of soldiers crowded aboard ships anchored for weeks in the summer heat along a coastline whose water and sanitation conditions were never designed to support a population of that size for any extended period begin suffering from what several surviving accounts describe as a serious outbreak of illness, moving through the fleet, weakening a force already worn down by weeks of frustrated fighting against a wall it could not break. The evidence remaining from this period does not allow historians to identify with certainty exactly what disease was spreading through those crowded ships, whether dysentery, some form of plague, or another illness common to armies of this era, confined too long in close unsanitary conditions. but the surviving casualty figures suggest its toll may have rivaled anything inflicted by Japanese blades along the shoreline. Does an army that has already lost momentum along a fortified wall that is now losing men, not to combat but to disease spreading quietly through its own ranks, still believe as the weeks stretch past a full month of waiting that reinforcement will arrive in time to salvage the campaign? Or does something closer to dread begin settling into a fleet that had expected an easy return to a shore it had already conquered once before? By the time the Southern Route Army finally begins arriving in early autumn, weeks later than originally planned, and considerably later than the Eastern Route armies, commanders had hoped the combined UN force preparing to finally press its full weight against Hakata Bay's defenders is not in any meaningful sense the fresh, overwhelming army Kublai Khan had assembled with such enormous effort back in China and Korea. It is a force already worn thin by a wall it never expected to face, by nights of Japanese raiders it never saw coming, and by an illness moving quietly through its own crowded decks, gathering now for what both sides sense will be the decisive confrontation of the entire war, unaware that the sky above the bay is already beginning to change in ways that neither Japanese nor UN commanders can yet fully read. And by late summer of 1281, the combined UN fleet Eastern and Southern forces finally joined together, after weeks of delay numbers, somewhere in the range of 4,000 vessels anchored on the waters near Takashima and the wider approach to Hakata Bay, more ships gathered in one place than the region had likely ever seen before or would see again for centuries. The commanders of this fleet, worn down already by the wall, the raids and the illness moving through their ranks, now face a decision that anyone who has spent time near open water in a Japanese summer would recognize as carrying its own quiet danger, whether to press the attack immediately or wait gathered together at anchor for a more favourable moment to strike. They choose to wait, and this choice, more than almost any single tactical decision made on either side throughout the entire war, may be the one that ultimately decides everything. What the UN commanders do not fully appreciate, crowded together, as they are with soldiers and sailors drawn from Mongolia, northern China and Korea, none of whom carry deep generational knowledge of these particular waters, is that the seas off Kyushu in late summer sit squarely within a season when large tropical storms regularly form and move northward along this stretch of coastline. A pattern well known to Japanese fishermen and sailors who have worked these waters for generations, but far less familiar to a command structure built from people who had spent their lives on rivers, plains, and the more predictable waters closer to the Chinese and Korean coast they had sailed from. On the 30th day of the 7th month, the storm arrives, and the accounts describing what follows, even stripped of centuries of embellishment, describe something genuinely catastrophic. A typhoon likely of considerable strength based on what modern meteorologists can reconstruct from the seasonal patterns and surviving descriptions moves directly across the anchored fleet, and the ships crowded together at anchor rather than dispersed and given room to ride out open water safely, begin colliding with one another, being driven onto rocks and shoals and in many cases simply breaking apart under wind and wave. That vessels of this era, built for river transport or coastal Chinese and Korean waters rather than open ocean typhoon conditions, were never designed to survive. Surviving UN and Korean records along with later Japanese accounts describe losses that are almost difficult to hold in the mind at their full scale, estimates suggesting that a substantial majority of the invasion fleet and a correspondingly enormous portion of the soldiers it carried perished either in the storm itself or in the chaotic, desperate fighting that Japanese defenders wage against the stranded survivors washing ashore in the storm's aftermath. This is the moment that later generations of Japanese would come to call the divine wind, a phrase that would echo forward through the centuries in ways no one standing on that beach in 1281 could possibly have imagined. Resurfacing 700 years later attached to pilots in an entirely different and far more modern war, carrying by then a meaning so transformed by history that the two moments share little beyond the borrowed name itself. It is worth sitting with that transformation for a moment, the strange journey a phrase can take across centuries, beginning as a description of genuine, desperate relief felt by a nation that had just watched an overwhelming invasion dissolve into wreckage before its eyes, and ending generations later attached to something the original defenders of Hakata Bay would scarcely have recognized as connected to their own experience at all. What modern archaeology has added to this story in the decades since underwater excavation became possible along this stretch of coastline offers something the written accounts alone could never fully provide, a physical, tangible confirmation of what those centuries-old records had described. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing with increasing sophistication into the 21st century, marine archaeologists working in the waters off Takashima have recovered an extraordinary quantity of material from the wreck sites scattered across the seabed. Their ship timbers, anchors, weapons, armour, fragments, and among the more striking finds, a number of the ceramic bomb casings. The same weapons that had so unsettled Japanese defenders 7 years earlier during the first invasion, found intact enough in some cases for researchers to reconstruct how they were likely constructed and deployed. There is a detail from this underwater research that rarely makes it into popular retellings of the story, and it deserves inclusion here because it adds a layer of scientific insight the written record alone could never have provided. Analysis of the recovered ship timbers has revealed something about how these vessels were actually constructed, evidence suggesting that a considerable number of the ships in the fleet, particularly among the hastily assembled Southern Route Army, were built using techniques and materials better suited to calmer river and coastal navigation than to the open ocean conditions they ultimately faced, a finding that lends real physical weight to the written accounts describing ships too hastily built for the storm that eventually found them. Scholars still debate, and likely always will, exactly how much of Japan's survival to credit to the typhoon itself, and how much to credit to everything that had already worn the invasion down before the storm ever arrived. The wall. The defenders had spent 7 years building the night raids that denied a resting force, the illness spreading quietly through overcrowded ships, all of it converging in the weeks before the sky finally turned against the fleet gathered offshore. Does a single storm deserve the full weight of credit that centuries of Japanese memory would eventually place upon it? Or was it simply the final blow against an invasion that had already been bleeding for weeks before the wind ever picked up? The evidence recovered from beneath the waves near Takashima does not answer that question definitively, and perhaps it never fully can, but it does offer something almost as valuable a way of touching this story directly. Timber and iron pulled up from the seabed after 7 centuries of silence, quiet, physical proof that everything the old accounts described once actually happened exactly there beneath exactly that water on a summer night, when the sky itself seemed to decide that Japan would not fall. Long after the storm has passed and the wreckage has washed up along the beaches of Kyushu, the story of what happened at Hakata Bay begins its second life not on the battlefield anymore, but on paper and silk in the careful, sometimes self-interested hands of the men who survived it and the descendants who inherited their memory. It is worth turning now to how we actually know any of this, because the sources behind this story carry their own history, their own gaps, and their own quiet human motivations, and understanding them adds something the battle scenes alone cannot offer, a sense of how fragile and how carefully constructed our access to the past really is. The single most valuable surviving account of the fighting at Hakata Bay comes as it happens not from a court chronicler or an official government record, but from Suenaga himself, the same minor retainer from Higo province whose experiences threaded through much of this story. Years after the fighting ends, Suenaga commissions a long illustrated scroll depicting his own actions during both invasions, a work of considerable artistic skill, combining vivid painted scenes with accompanying text, and this scroll survives remarkably into the present day, offering historians something no dry official record could ever provide: a visual moment-by-moment account of what individual combat actually looked like on that beach, rendered by someone who had lived it. It is worth pausing on why Swenageia commissioned this scroll at all, because the reason turns out to matter enormously for how historians read the document today, and it introduces a thread that will carry forward into what this story becomes in its final chapters. Suenaga does not create this scroll purely out of a desire to preserve history for its own sake. He creates it, according to most historical readings of the accompanying texts, as part of a personal campaign to secure recognition and reward for his service, travelling in person to Kamakura in the years following the invasions to press his case before the shogunate's officials, frustrated by what he and many other provincial warriors experienced as an inadequate response to the sacrifices they had made defending the homeland. The scroll, in other words, functions as something closer to a visual petition, a carefully constructed argument for Suenaga's own valour and usefulness, commissioned by a man who felt with some justification that his role in one of the most consequential conflicts in Japanese history was at real risk of being forgotten or undervalued by the very government he had risked his life to protect. This detail changes how a careful historian has to read everything the scroll depicts, and it is worth sitting with that complexity rather than smoothing it away. Does this mean Suenaga's account is unreliable, a work of self-serving fiction dressed up as history? Most scholars working with the document today would say the answer is considerably more nuanced than either full trust or full skepticism would suggest. The broad outline of events the scroll depicts: the landing, the fighting near the beach, the wounding, the withdrawal behind the Mizuki earthwork aligns closely enough with other surviving Japanese, Korean, and Chinese sources that historians treat its overall narrative as fundamentally reliable. Where caution becomes necessary is in the details closest to Suenaga's own personal glory, the moments the scroll lingers on longest, the instances where his individual courage is most vividly rendered. Precisely the kind of detail a man petitioning for reward would have every reason to emphasize, whether or not every element unfolded in quite so flattering a light in the actual chaos of that day. The evidence remains incomplete in a way that will likely never fully resolve, because Suenaga is in a very real sense both our best witness to this battle and an interested party in how that battle is remembered, two roles that sit uneasily together in the same document. There is a broader question sitting underneath this single scroll one that touches nearly every source describing these invasions, and it deserves honest attention here rather than being smoothed over in favour of a cleaner story. Historians examining the full range of surviving accounts, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese alike, have long noted meaningful discrepancies in the numbers each tradition assigns to the invading fleets. The casualty figures from the typhoon and the overall scale of the disaster that befell the UN forces. Later Japanese chronicles, written in some cases generations after the events themselves and shaped by a growing cultural narrative about divine protection, tend toward figures on the more dramatic end of what the evidence can support, sometimes describing losses so total and so absolute that modern historians working from Korean and Chinese administrative records, which had their own reasons for accuracy given the resources and manpower involved, suggest a somewhat less apocalyptic though still catastrophic picture of the fleet's destruction. Scholars still debate exactly where the truth sits within this range of surviving figures, and it is worth resisting the temptation one this genre of storytelling sometimes gives into of simply reaching for whichever number produces the most dramatic telling. What the underwater archaeology near Takashima has contributed to this ongoing conversation discussed earlier, in this story offers physical confirmation that a very large number of ships did indeed sink in that location, consistent with a genuinely massive loss, but the precise proportion of the fleet destroyed and the precise number of soldiers who perished rather than being captured or somehow escaping the storm remains a question the surviving evidence cannot answer with the exact certainty that later, more dramatic Japanese retellings would eventually claim. This uncertainty extends in fact to a detail that surprises many people encountering this story closely for the first time, one that complicates the clean narrative of total annihilation that popular memory has attached to this invasion. Surviving Korean and Chinese records suggest that a meaningful number of Yuan soldiers, likely numbering in the tens of thousands, did survive the storm and the subsequent fighting on the beaches, only to be captured by Japanese forces in the chaotic days that followed. What happened to these prisoners afterward is recorded with troubling clarity in several Japanese sources describing mass executions carried out along the shore in the storm's immediate aftermath. Though a smaller number of captives, according to some accounts, primarily those identified as Chinese rather than Mongol or Korean, appear to have been spared outright killing and instead enslaved, absorbed into Japanese households and communities in a manner the surviving records describe only briefly and without the kind of detail that would let modern historians fully reconstruct what became of them in the years that followed. It is a quiet, uncomfortable footnote to a story more often remembered for its dramatic storm than for what happened to the human beings left stranded in that storm's wake, and it deserves to be held honestly alongside everything else this conflict cost on both sides of the water. There is one more layer of evidence worth bringing into this account before moving forward, because it offers a different kind of insight than either the written chronicles or the underwater wrecks, something closer to the everyday texture of what these years actually felt like for the ordinary people living through them. Archaeological excavation along the surviving sections of the defensive wall near Hakata Bay, conducted intermittently over the past century, has revealed details about its construction that the written administrative records only partially capture variations in stone-size construction technique and wall thickness from one section to the next that correspond closely with the differing wealth and resources of the individual provincial families assigned to build each segment. Wealthier landholding families, the excavations suggest, were able to construct taller, more solidly built sections using higher quality stone, while poorer communities produced sections that were by comparison considerably more modest, sometimes built from whatever local material was closest at hand. This is a small detail easy to overlook amid the drama of storms and battles, but it offers something the grandeur chronicles never bother to record: a physical trace of inequality etched directly into the very defences that saved the nation. A reminder that even a unified national effort against a shared existential threat still bent in its execution around the older patterns of wealth and obligation that governed everyday life in Kamakura, Japan. Taken together, these different threads of evidence, Suenaga's self-interested but invaluable scroll the competing casualty figures across three separate written traditions, the fate of the captured soldiers left out of the more triumphant retellings, and the physical uneven stonework still visible along fragments of the old wall. Today offer something more honest and more textured than the single clean story of a divine wind saving a united and equally sacrificing nation. Does a story need to be simplified into something closer to legend in order to be remembered for 7 centuries? Or is it possible for the more complicated, more human version, uncertain numbers and uncomfortable footnotes included, to carry just as much weight once you actually sit with it? The version this evidence points toward is not a lesser story for its complexity. If anything, it is a fuller one filled with individual men petitioning for recognition, provincial communities of unequal means, building what defences they could afford, and a fleet whose destruction, however catastrophic, still left behind captured lives that history mostly declined to follow any further. What all of this evidence cannot fully answer, and what becomes the central unresolved question hanging over everything that follows in the years after the storm, is what this victory, this survival, against an empire that had conquered nearly everything else, it had ever turned toward actually meant for the men who lived through it, and the government that had asked so much of them. The wall stands, the fleet is gone, Suenaga is alive wounded, but alive still waiting scroll in hand. For a government he had risked everything to protect to finally acknowledge what that protection had cost him. The question left hanging at the close of the last account, what this survival actually cost the men who lived through it, turns out to have an answer considerably more complicated and considerably more instructive than the triumphant ending most retellings of this story are content to stop at. To understand what happens to Japan in the years following the storm at Takashima, it helps to return to something introduced much earlier in this story, a detail about the very foundations of how Kamakura Japan rewarded its warriors, because that detail, easy to overlook amid the drama of the fighting itself, becomes the quiet engine driving everything that follows. The system of loyalty and reward that had sustained the Kamakura shogunate for nearly a century rested on a simple, almost mechanical logic. A warrior served his lord and ultimately the shogunate, in exchange for the expectation that victory would eventually be paid for in land typically confiscated from a defeated enemy and redistributed among those who had fought well enough to earn it. This system had worked generation after generation through Japan's long history of internal conflict. Because Japanese wars had always in the end produced Japanese losers, rival clans whose confiscated holdings could be passed down to the victors as tangible lasting proof that service had been recognized and rewarded. The war against the Mongols breaks this system in a way nothing in Japan's prior history had ever tested. And it breaks it in the most straightforward way imaginable, one that becomes painfully obvious only once the fighting is over and the accounting begins. There is no conquered territory. The enemy came from across the sea and having been defeated simply went home or drowned, or was executed on the beach leaving behind wreckage and bodies, but no land whatsoever that the shogunate could redistribute among the tens of thousands of warriors who had risked everything to defend the coastline. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it represents a genuinely unprecedented problem for Kamakura's government, one that no amount of administrative skill could fully solve, since the fundamental resource the entire reward system depended upon simply did not exist in this case. Provincial samurai families across Kyushu and beyond, men who had answered the call to arms, fortified the coastline with their own labour, fought and in many cases died defending a homeland under direct existential threat, now found themselves waiting for a form of compensation that the war itself had made structurally impossible to provide. Suenaga's own long campaign for recognition discussed in the previous account was not an isolated case of one frustrated warrior seeking personal glory. It reflects in miniature a crisis playing out across the entire warrior class. Tens of thousands of men and their families waiting for a shogunate that increasingly had nothing tangible left to give them. What Kamakura actually does in response to this crisis reveals something about the limits of even a well-intentioned government facing a problem its own institutions were never designed to solve. The shogunate does distribute what it can, drawing on the more limited pool of temple and shrine lands, confiscated estates from families that had opposed the ruling Hojo clan in earlier internal conflicts, and various forms of honorary titles and minor privileges that carried prestige without the substantial material value of land itself. But the surviving records make clear that this response falls far short of what the scale of the mobilization had seemed to promise, and the gap between service rendered and reward received becomes in the years following the invasions a source of genuine and growing resentment among the provincial warrior families who had carried the heaviest burden of the fighting. There is a detail here that rarely receives the attention it deserves in the more condensed versions of this story, and it deepens the human weight of what this financial and political crisis actually meant for ordinary families living through it. The years of defensive preparation before the second invasion, the wall, the coastal patrols, the constant mobilization readiness had already placed enormous financial strain on provincial samurai households, who were expected to fund their own equipment, their own horses, their own men, largely from their own resources, with the understanding that eventual victory and reward would justify the expense. Surviving land transaction records from this period, studied by historians examining the economic history of Kamakura, Japan, show a marked increase in the number of samurai families forced to mortgage, sell, or otherwise dispose of portions of their inherited landholdings. In the years following the invasions, a quiet, unglamorous form of headship playing out in provincial estates across the country, entirely disconnected from the drama of storms and battles that dominates the more celebrated tellings of this war. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread and how severe this financial strain actually became across the full warrior class, since the surviving records are uneven and concentrated in certain regions more than others, but the broad pattern they reveal is consistent enough that most historians treat this economic hardship as a genuine and significant consequence of the war, not merely an incidental footnote to it. This financial strain intersects with something else worth introducing here, a structural feature of Japanese inheritance customs in this era that made the land shortage even more consequential than it might otherwise have been. Kamakura, Japan practiced a system of partible inheritance, meaning a samurai's land holdings were typically divided among his heirs rather than passed intact to a single successor, a practice that had already been slowly fragmenting warrior family estates into smaller and smaller parcels across successive generations even before the added pressure of war debt and unmet reward expectations. A family that might have comfortably supported one heir a century earlier now finds its shrinking landholding divided yet again among several sons, each one expected to maintain the equipment and readiness of a warrior on an increasingly modest resource base. A slow demographic and economic squeeze operating quietly beneath the surface of the more visible political grievances over unpaid war debts. Does a government facing this scale of financial and political pressure coming so soon after what should have been its greatest triumph still command the same loyalty it had enjoyed before the invasions? Or does the growing distance between sacrifice and reward begin quietly and gradually to erode the very foundation the shogunate's authority had always rested upon? The evidence suggests the latter, though the erosion is slow, uneven, and not immediately fatal to Kamakura's rule. It takes decades, not years, for this accumulated resentment to fully express itself, but historians examining the broader arc of Kamakura's decline consistently point back to this period, the years following the failed invasions, as a genuine turning point, the moment when the underlying bond between the shogunate and its provincial warrior class begins to fray in ways that never fully mend. There's a further complication worth including here, one that adds an unexpected dimension to this story of financial strain and political erosion. The war's cost was not borne solely by the warrior class directly involved in the fighting. Temples and shrines across the country called upon during the crisis to conduct sustained prayers and rituals for the nation's protection later petitioned the shogunate for recognition and reward of their own arguing, with evident sincerity in the surviving petitions that their spiritual intervention had been every bit as responsible for the typhoon's arrival as the physical defense along the beach, and that they too deserved land or other compensation for services rendered to the nation. This claim, difficult as it may be for a modern audience to fully credit, was taken with genuine seriousness by a government operating within the religious worldview of its own era, and several major temples and shrines did in fact receive land grants and privileges in the years following the invasions, competing directly with the samurai warrior class for a pool of available resources that was already by any measure insufficient to satisfy the more tangible battlefield claims being pressed by men like Suenaga. It is a strange, almost poignant footnote to this story. Warriors who had bled on the beach, finding themselves in quiet competition for reward against priests who had prayed from a safe distance, both groups equally convinced in the logic of their era that their contribution had been decisive. What emerges from all of this, pieced together across land records, inheritance patterns, and the frustrated petitions of men like Suenaga, is a picture considerably more sobering than the story of triumphant survival that popular memory tends to settle on. Japan had, against genuinely overwhelming odds, twice repelled the largest invasion force the world had yet assembled, a genuine and remarkable achievement by any measure. And yet that same victory, precisely because it produced no conquered territory to redistribute, set in motion a slow unravelling of the very system that had made the victory possible in the first place, a warrior class increasingly burdened by debt and unmet expectation, a shogunate increasingly unable to fulfill the basic promise its authority had always rested upon. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how consciously the Hojo regents governing Kamakura in these years understood the depth of the crisis they were presiding over, whether they recognized the slow erosion happening beneath their feet or simply managed each individual grievance as it arose, without grasping the larger pattern it was part of. But what the historical record makes clear is that the seeds of Kamakura's eventual fall, still decades away at this point in the story, are already quietly taking root in these very years in the disappointed petitions and mortgaged estates of the men who had saved their homeland and received for their trouble considerably less than they had been promised. Somewhere in a provincial household not far from the coast, his family had helped defend an aging Suenaga. His petition for recognition finally settled after years of pressing his case likely could not have known that the frustration he and men like him carried in these years would in time help unravel the very government he had risked his life to protect. That unravelling belongs to a slower, quieter part of this story, one that unfolds not on any battlefield but across decades of accumulating resentment, shrinking estates, and a gradually widening distance between a government and the warrior class it had once been able to count on without question. History does not close its books neatly, and the story of Japan's encounter with the Mongol invasions refuses that kind of tidy ending as thoroughly as any war ever fought. What began with an empire's letters left unanswered and ended with a shattered fleet scattered across the seabed near Takashima leaves behind it not a single clean lesson, but a whole constellation of them, each one worth carrying forward as this long night's journey through history draws toward its close. Consider for a moment everything this story has actually been about beneath its surface of ships and storms and stone walls. It has been about an empire that believed with good reason, given everything it had already conquered, that its will alone should be enough to bend any nation. It turned its attention toward and about a smaller nation that discovered at tremendous cost that survival sometimes depends less on strength alone than on the accumulated weight of small decisions. A wall built stone by families who expected no glory for the labour night raids launched by men willing to risk everything in the dark, a young regent choosing defiance when submission would have been so much easier. It has been about weather too, about the genuine, undeniable role that a summer typhoon played in deciding the fate of an island nation, and about how thoroughly that single storm would come to overshadow in the centuries of memory that followed everything the defenders themselves had already accomplished before the sky ever turned against the invading fleet. There is a pattern here worth naming plainly because it recurs throughout human history far beyond this one conflict in far more places than 13th century Japan. Victory, even genuine hard-won victory, against overwhelming odds does not always deliver what it promises to the people who purchased it with their own blood and labour. Suenaga's long frustrated petition for recognition, the mortgaged estates of provincial samurai families, the quiet, decades-long unravelling of a shogunate that had once commanded absolute loyalty, all of it traces back to a single, almost mathematical problem, a war fought and won against an enemy that left behind no land to distribute among the men who had defended the homeland. It is a strange kind of tragedy, one that rarely makes it into the shorter, more triumphant tellings of this story. The tragedy of a victory too complete in one sense and too empty in another, a nation saved from conquest that nonetheless spent the following decades slowly consuming the very trust between government and warrior that had made its salvation possible in the first place. And yet it would be its own kind of dishonesty to let that slow institutional decay be the final note this story leaves behind, because there is another pattern running alongside it, equally true, equally worth carrying forward. Kamakura's government did eventually fall, though not for another 50 years, and when it fell the causes were many and tangled economic strain from the invasions mixing with unrelated political pressures, court rivalries, and the ordinary churn of medieval Japanese politics that would have continued with or without Kublai Khan's fleets ever appearing on the horizon. Scholars still debate how much weight to place on the Mongol invasions, specifically within that larger, more complicated collapse, whether historians looking backward have sometimes been too eager to draw a straight line from one dramatic storm to a governmental fall that happened, in truth, for a great many overlapping reasons. What is not in question, whatever the precise weighting of causes, is that Japan itself survived intact, its language, its culture, its people unconquered by an empire that had by that point in its history conquered nearly everything else it had ever seriously attempted. The shogunate that fell in the 1330s was replaced by another Japanese government, not by a UN governor, not by a foreign administration imposed from across the sea. Whatever else was lost in the decades of strain that followed the invasions, that particular outcome, a Japan still governed by the Japanese hand, still speaking its own language and following its own customs, was never seriously in doubt again. After that summer, storms scattered the last of Kublai Khan's ambitions across the waters near Takashima. There is a piece of evidence worth returning to now near the close of this long story, one that has already appeared earlier in a different context, but that carries a different weight when you sit with it here at the end, rather than in the middle of the telling. Among the countless fragments recovered from the wreck, sites near Takashima, timbers and anchors and weapons pulled up from centuries of silence beneath the waves, marine archaeologists have also found something smaller, something easier to overlook amid the more dramatic finds, a scattering of everyday objects, cooking, implements, personal tools, small items that would have belonged not to commanders or officers but to ordinary soldiers and sailors, men whose names appear in no chronicle, whose individual stories no scroll was ever commissioned to preserve. There is something worth sitting with in that detail, a reminder that beneath every grand narrative of empires and invasions and divine winds, there were always simply people, thousands upon thousands of them on both sides of that water, each one carrying a small ordinary life into a conflict none of them had any real power to prevent or fully control. The commanders had their names recorded. Suenaga had his scroll. Most of the men who actually crossed that water, or waited on that beach to meet them, left behind nothing but scattered fragments now resting quietly in museum cases unlabelled and unclaimed by any individual history, and yet unmistakably, undeniably evidence that a person was once there. This is perhaps the truest thing this whole long story has to offer, once the storms and the walls and the political consequences have all been laid out and considered. Empires rise with a confidence that feels from the inside like it could never possibly end, and they are every one of them without exception, eventually humbled by something they did not fully anticipate, a wall they had not expected to face, a season of weather they did not know intimately enough to fear, a resistance from people they had underestimated, because underestimation is what every great power eventually does to those it has not yet been forced to respect. And ordinary people, the ones without scrolls commissioned in their honour, the provincial farmers who built a wall with their own hands, the nameless sailors whose cooking pots now rest in museum cases, carry the weight of these great historical collisions in ways that the grander histories rarely pause long enough to fully honour. The wall along Hakata Bay still exists today in fragments weathered and mostly buried beneath the modern city that has grown up around it, though sections remain visible for anyone who knows where to look along the Fukuoka coastline, stone laid by hands that expected no monument and received for the most part none. Suenaga's scroll survives as well preserved and studied his petition for recognition long since settled by a government that no longer exists in any form he would recognize. His own name remembered now, not because Kamakura eventually rewarded him adequately, but because he took it upon himself to make certain that someone someday would know he had been there. That is where this story wants to rest tonight before it lets you go. Not with the storm dramatic as it was, not with the fall of a government slow and complicated as that unravelling turned out to be, but with something quieter than either, a stretch of stone half buried now beneath a city that has forgotten most of what it once protected. A man who paid out of his own pocket to make sure his part in something enormous would not simply vanish. And somewhere beneath dark water near an island, most people will never visit small ordinary objects, a cooking pot, a tool, nothing grand. Nothing meant to be remembered, resting exactly where they settled 7 centuries ago. The empire that sent them there no longer exists. The government that called the men who built the wall to arms no longer exists either. Only the coastline remains patient, unbothered, the way coastlines always are. The tide still comes in, the tide still goes out, and somewhere beneath it quietly history simply waits to be found.